Bright Tuty. Every student matters.
So that gave us a brief overview, brief outlook of the urbanization or the process of urbanization during the colonial rule, after and before it as well. Okay, so now we move to the first topic, and in this topic we'll look at the towns and how they looked during the colonial rule. Okay, so first we'll look at the ports, the forts, and the centers of services. So services meaning commercial, political, economic, etc. Alright, so we already know that by the end of the 18th century, cities like Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta had developed into important cities, but not only cities, there were important ports. These were important ports from where goods were sent to Europe, goods were brought from Europe to be sold in India. Okay. Now these ports were important points for collecting goods, for distributing raw materials, for also distributing or collecting manufactured goods to be sold in India. Okay. Now in these ports, in these cities, the English East India Company or the British government also set up its factories, commercial offices or centers. Okay. Now they also fortified, they built forts around these cities like Madras, Bombay and Calcutta. They built forts to secure their settlement, to protect their factories, to protect their ports. Okay, against enemies and rivals, both European as well as the native rulers. Okay, so in Madras they built Fort St. George, in Calcutta they built Fort William, and in Bombay they built Fort Market. Okay. Now, the Indian merchants and the Indians, the natives. Okay, so the Indians were called natives. Where did they live? If the Europeans and the British lived inside the forts, where did the Indians live? So the Indian merchants, the artisans and other workers, they lived in settlements, in areas that were built right outside these forts. They were not inside of the forts with the British, but outside of the forts. Okay. So as you can see, there was a separation of the Europeans and the Indians and where they lived. Okay, the Indians lived outside the forts, the Europeans lived inside the forts. Okay, now as the settlements of the Europeans or the British and the settlements of the Indians grew and developed, these settlements, the separated settlements, came to be known as White Town and Black Town. Obviously, the White Town indicated the settlement of the Europeans and the Black Town indicated the settlements of the Indians. Okay. Now, with the establishment of the railways, with the introduction of railways, the railways connected the three cities, the three important commercial centers and as well as three important political centers. Okay, Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, they were connected by railways. Okay, now the railways not only connected these three cities but connected these three cities to the countryside as well. So the railways brought raw materials to these port cities from where they were sent out to Europe. Okay, and the connection also helped to bring the laborers who worked in the factories, who worked in building houses, offices in the colonial cities. Okay, after 1850, cotton and jute mills were also set up. Okay, so as you can see, there was establishment of so many things going on in the 19th century. Railways came up, industries were built, now mills were built, buildings were built. Okay, so the development of urban areas, cities and towns during the colonial period were increasing. Okay. So Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, they grew into large cities. Okay. Now, as we say that the development of Bombay, Calcutta, Madras was increasing, but that does not mean that the growth or the economic growth of the entire country, of the whole of India, was also increasing. So we have to understand that as we are saying that Bombay, Calcutta, Madras grew into large cities and they also saw economic growth. But that does not mean that the whole of India grew economically, that the whole of India was also prospering. Because the British government never wanted to introduce industrialization in India. It never wanted to make India a modern industrialized country. Okay, it never wanted to prosper India economically. Alright, that was not their main aim. Okay. So now let's look at how this new setup of cities and towns under the colonial rule looked like. Okay, what did it mean? So we'll now try to understand the new urban environment. Alright, what happened inside the cities, what happened inside the towns. Alright. The colonial cities reflected the mercantile culture of the British. Okay, the colonial cities, they reflected the interest, they reflected the ambition or the vision of the British. Okay, now Indians who served as interpreters, middlemen, traders, suppliers of goods for the British government, they occupied important place in these cities. Okay, they were important to the British government because they worked as interpreters for them. They interpreted from Hindi to English, from English to Hindi whenever they required. They also acted as middlemen when the British wanted to negotiate, do business, trade, etc., or maybe have a diplomatic relation with the native ruler, right? So these Indian people played important role in the British administration and they occupied important place in the new cities. Alright. Now the economic activity near the river or the sea also led to the growth of docks and ghats. Now we said that the activities in the cities like Bombay, Madras and Calcutta, they also acted as important ports, right? Now the activities of economic importance which took place near the river or the sea, that led to the growth of the docks. The docks became important, the ghats became important, the harbors became now important, okay? Mercantile offices, shipping and insurance companies, transport depots and banks were also located along the seashore. Now the seashore became important spot for the trade, for the commerce. So the offices, shipping, insurance, banking companies, transport depots, all of these began to be set up along the shore, along the banks of the river. Okay. Administrative buildings, houses in European styles, clubs, race courses, theatres, cinema halls also began to come up, began to be built in these centers of commercial hubs. Okay. Rich Indian agents and middlemen, they built their houses in Blacktown. Now, despite this importance or the role played by the rich Indian merchants, the middlemen, the interpreters, these Indian merchants and officers, they did not live in the White Town. They lived in the Black Town, but they built magnificent houses in the Black Town. Okay. Now these rich Indians, they acquired large tracts of land in the city as future investment. They also built large areas of land. Okay, to win the favor of their British masters, they many times threw parties. These parties were lavish during festivals, like for example, festivals of the Shera Diwali. They would throw huge parties, invite the British officials, the government bodies, and have social interaction. Okay, they also built temples in the cities, okay, in the towns, so that such activities increase their prestige, increase their social status, okay. The poor laborers, what did they do? They provided a variety of services to the European and Indian masters. They worked as cooks, they worked as palanquin bearers, they worked as coachmen, they worked as guards, porters, and also for the construction, when the construction took place in the dock areas, in the new cities, towns, and in the harbors and on the banks of the rivers. Okay, so the poorest section of the Indian society, they worked as laborers, and they served not only their colonial masters but their Indian masters as well, the rich, wealthy Indian merchants, traders, and the officers. Okay. Now, in the 18th century, there were further changes that could be seen in the cities. Okay. Now, what was this change? After the revolt of 1857, this was one of the biggest events in the 19th century. Now, after this event, what happened? The British began to fear. Okay, the British began to be afraid, and afraid for what? Afraid for the recurrence of rebellion or revolt from the people. Okay, they feared that another revolt or rebellion might occur, might happen again against them. Okay, so this helped in shaping the attitude of the colonial rulers and also their role in developing new cities and towns. Okay, now they felt that they should live in a more secure areas. Now, areas where they lived before 1857, like the cities of Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, these were not so secure. Okay, now they had to find more secure areas away from all kinds of threats and attacks from the Indian natives. Okay, so because of that fear that they held, they began to live in areas, settlements called civil lines. These civil lines were outside of the main cities. Okay, and they also developed cantonment in these areas. Now, broad streets, bungalows set amidst large gardens, barracks, parade grounds, and churches. So, in these areas, civil lines, they built broad streets, alright, bungalows with gardens, barracks where the soldiers lived, the parade grounds, churches, etc. Okay, and they became the model of ordered urban life in contrast to the congested towns where the Indians lived. Now, these new settlements where the British began to live away from the Indians, okay, where they built bungalows, beautiful European style bungalows with gardens, the streets were broader, and it had churches, parks, etc. This became a model, an example for how an urban city should be, in contrast to the Indian ones, which were congested, dirty, and unhygienic. Okay, so the black areas or the cities or towns where the Indians lived, they were called black towns, right? Now, these towns began to be identified with chaos, anarchy, dirt, and disease. So the British government or the British administration, they were only concerned with the cleanliness and hygiene of the white towns or the white areas. They did not bother themselves with the black areas and the unhygienic conditions and the chaos that existed in those black towns. Okay, it was only after the later half of the 19th century that measures were taken by the British administration to fight the congestion, to fight the insanitation, to fight the chaos, or to improve the living conditions in the black towns or the black areas or the settlement of the Indian natives. Okay. Now we'll quickly look at social life in these new cities, the cities built by the colonial government, cities like Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay. Okay. Now these new cities, they saw both extreme wealth as well as woeful poverty. So there was extremes of both the side. There was growth of commercial activities, so the rich were getting richer, but there were also poor laborers and workers living in utter poverty in these cities. Okay. Of course, the cities saw development of new modes of transportation. So there were horse-drawn carriages, and subsequently there were also trams, buses and trains. We already said that over the period of time, introduction of railways happened, and there were also introduction of other better modern modes of transportations. So now what happened with the introduction of modern means of transportation, people living in the outskirts could come or travel to the cities for their employment, for work. Okay, so the distance now minimized. They became lesser. Okay, distance did not become a problem for the people. Now people who lived at distant places could come to their work, which were far away before and took many hours or days to travel. So the separation of the place of work lessened from the place of their residence. Okay, distance no longer became a problem. But the familiarity of the old towns now disappeared, because with the growth and development of means of transportation, with emergence of and construction of buildings, palaces and other social activity areas like parks, cinema halls, theaters, etc., the familiarity of the old towns which existed, say for example during the Mughal period, that began to slowly disappear. That saw gradual disappearance. Okay, so there was creation of now new public spaces. Now these public spaces are called public spaces because they could be used by the public, the masses, the people, right? And these public spaces were public parks, the parks, theaters, cinema halls, clubhouses, etc. And what was the purpose of these parks or social spaces or public spaces? They provided forms of entertainment, different forms of entertainment and social intercourse or interaction between people in these areas. Alright? Now, apart from these changes in the new cities, there was also this new group of people that came into existence in the cities, because we already know that with the growth of the colonial cities and towns, people began to migrate from the outskirts into the city. These people were laborers, these people were workers, but at the same time there were also rich natives, rich Indians, rich merchants and traders. Okay. So people from all sections of society began to migrate to the big cities, okay? Because these big cities like Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, they saw increasing demand for clerks, for teachers, for lawyers, for doctors, engineers, and accountants. Okay, so now these kind of employments, they were fulfilled by this new group of people that emerged. Now, what was this group? They were called the middle class. Okay, so this middle class, a category of people in the society of India that saw growth in these cities, okay, colonial cities. So these were called the middle classes. Now these middle class people, they were educated. They went to schools, they went to colleges, hence they were educated. They also received Western education. Okay. Now because they had received education, they could now express opinions on the society, on the state of government. Alright. So their opinions were expressed in newspapers, in journals and in public meetings. Okay. Where they had debate and where they had discussions. Okay. So now these educated middle class, they began to question the social customs, the various social norms and practices, the traditions, alright. So all these began to be questioned by this new group of people called the middle classes. Okay. Now, of course, they tried to bring social changes. Of course, they challenged the evil practices in the society, which the Indians performed for so many years. Alright. So, as they advocated for social change. Social change or change in the society did not come easily or abruptly. Okay, it was not easy for new changes to be brought by these middle class people who were voicing their opinions. All right. Now, apart from these middle class people, there were also the poor and the laborers belonging to the working class. Okay, they also lived within the city walls and they provided services to the colonial masters, to the British masters as well as the Indian masters. Okay. The poor people, why did they live in the cities? Because they came to the cities for employment, for better living standard. All right. Now, some were attracted for employment, some were attracted by the way of life that the cities provided, that the cities promised to offer. Okay. Now, the cost of living in the cities obviously was very high compared to the rural areas. So, most of the male workers, most of the male laborers, they left their families behind in their villages, in the countryside, and brought themselves to the cities to find employment, to work and send some money back to their families. Okay. Life in the city was a struggle. Jobs were uncertain, although there were emergence of new employment and opportunities, but they were uncertain. Food was expensive and there was no houses for them to live. We already saw how one of the important and significant problems that these emerging colonial cities saw was the housing problem, lack of houses for the workers and for the laborers. All right. So life in the city was not as easy as it sounded. It was a struggle. All right. But despite all these problems, despite all these drawbacks of the colonial cities, the urban culture or the life in the urban areas, the cities and towns were quite lively. All right. There were religious festivals, there were tamashas, there were folk theaters, and there were also fairs, etc., where people came together, celebrated, took part in cultural activities, etc. Okay, so this was how the new emerging cities saw or witnessed. Okay,